So good morning, everybody. How are you doing? Good. Struggling your way through or whatever. You know, it's like when you work with the body, you're working underneath the mind. You're working underneath the thinking mind. I'll talk about it a little bit in a minute, but most psychology is going in through all these abstract layers that we talked about. You know, you're talking about things, talking about your life, how you perceived it, and stuff like that. When you work with the body, you're working deeper inside, underneath the thinking mind. So it can be challenging. If your mind is quite held, and maybe you're not aware that your mind is quite held, suddenly you can feel like, fuck this shit, or I just want to get out of here. It's completely normal, completely human. You know, I need to exert more control over my environment, whatever. You know, it's like these are entirely normal reactions because we don't realize what's really going on in our mind. But we're working with these techniques underneath the mind because there are gaps in our foundation, you know, and so do your best to stay with it, and if you're struggling, come and chat to me or Abby, Pramesh, Louise. Do your best because it's working underneath. It's a little bit like a washing machine sometimes, just charging into stuff and you don't know what the fuck's quite going on. You know? And I'll talk a little bit more about why it's scary in a minute, but like, just with this talk is going to be more about using the body in psychology, you know, because that's what we're doing here, body-based therapy. And just to recap a little bit yesterday, because it was a bit weird and complicated, or unless you're used to really kind of ultra-modern theories about society, cybernetics, social forms, and all kind of memetics and weird social media, Web 2 stuff, then you probably think, what the fuck was all that about? But what we were really talking about was like how Westerners in particular started to create very abstracted minds, and the idea of who you were, you know, who I am, you know, started to become more and more complex because of the way that certain philosophers, Descartes and Kant, you don't need to know anything about, you know, basically became so dominant. Their thoughts and ideas became so dominant in Western civilization 200-300 years ago. And at the same time, this was reflected by the arrival of kind of industrial capitalism in its infancy from like the Midlands of Britain, basically. You know, guys running factories learned to reinvest their money back in the factory, and they created this feedback loop, which is alien in a sense. It's exciting, but it's also a little bit different from what humans do. Left to our own devices, we'd probably just go around in a circle forever. Have a few kids, you know, and bring them up. You know, there wouldn't be much development or change. You know, we would just be going round in circles. So humans are always excited by something which can change us. You know? It's like, but then, you know, the issue has been that we've slowly become more and more abstracted. For a while we were getting a lot from this kind of almost like a little demon we invited into our world. You know, it gave us development, it gave us more mental development, it gave us more goods and cultural development and science and new materials. You know, babies didn't have to die of like bad water and stuff like that. People didn't, you know, we could make houses, you know, it was pretty cool for a long time. This little kind of demon that we invented, we invoked into our world. And we kind of thought we had control over it. But what's become clear in the last 5-10 years is that, or certainly to people who study this shit, that we don't really have much control over it. And actually it's just kind of running amok now and is like quite possibly going to devastate the ecosystem and simultaneously leave people so utterly abstracted that their mental health and physical health just completely deteriorates, particularly once they get past 40, you know. And that it's simultaneously giving them lots of ideas about how they can change things, but actually they're just getting more and more sucked into the same spiral of abstraction. And in that state, it's hard to come back to the core, primate core in the belly, where there's emotions, real deep, intense emotions. We start to get abstracted, and then we've had 20-30 years being abstracted. It's like, do I really take a risk to go right into the core of emotional intensity of the human body, the primate, or in the heart? It's like it's super challenging. It's super challenging. We're like gamblers at a table. We kind of think we've got quite a good hand. We're going to risk it all, to really uncover the whole lot. Anyway, in a sense, living in abstract worlds is not really the problem. The problem is that we can't come back. That's the problem. We can't come back down the ladder. We get up here in this world and we get stuck there. So we don't have control over our own state, or adequate control. And I think that was about it for yesterday. Looks a little bit at what embodiment really means, but it doesn't mean little memes of you sitting in a nice mountain top with the word embodiment above it. That's a signalling behaviour. It's about feeling the body more. And I just wanted to talk a bit about the body in psychology because, like back 150 years ago, in the middle of the 19th century, like 1850s, when they wanted to understand why some people were more fucked up than others in terms of like being socially adjusted and fitting in or freaking out or whatever, they used to wait till they died and then kind of cut their heads open and see if there was something wrong with their brain. This was popular in Northern Europe, Charcot in Paris. This was the standard approach, neurology, basically. This person's normal, let's see what their brain's like after they've died, and this one was a bit mad, let's have a look at his brain and see if there's some kind of difference. That's what people were doing. It wasn't really it made a little bit of progress, but it wasn't really doing so good. So the idea that there was something wrong with people's brains, and this was why they didn't fit into society quite as well as they should, it wasn't really developing very well. And then right at the end of the 19th century, this bloke in Austria, Sigmund Freud, he wrote a book. He started to write books in the 1890s, The Interpretation of Dreams, later on Pleasure Principle, and these kind of books. And he started to basically come up with the idea of the mind, basically, that it's not all to do with the brain. He said, we're not getting anywhere looking at the brain, which is solid and tangible. Here it is, here's the brain, we can look at it. He said, you've got to look at the mind, which is a lot less tangible. You can't find your mind. You can't escape your mind, really. So he started to look at the mind and he created different concepts like the idea of an unconscious mind. That there's a part of you that's taking decisions or doing stuff that you're not consciously aware of. The idea of repression, that trauma or social conditioning causes you to repress your emotionality. You have the idea of libido, came usually from like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and that's like this drive inside of you, either towards sex or power, creativity, whatever, but there's this drive inside, libido. He had the idea of, superego. Anyone know what superego is meant to be, the Freudian superego?
Controller.
Yeah. It's like it's like an internalized voice of authority that tells you what's okay behavior and what's not okay behavior. Most of these concepts are pretty accurate, If I was to suddenly start ripping my clothes off, you'd probably think, God, he's gone fucking nuts, That's the superego comes in. It tells you who you should be in your society. It's like an internalized voice of authority. With some people it's very, very strong and they just can't really bear to do anything a little bit different. And with others they have inadequate superego and they're just continually breaching boundaries and just charging out all over the place. So these concepts became very popular from like 1900s, 1910, 1920, and psychology at that point became like the emergent kind of middle classes of Northern Europe, from Britain going right across Germany, Austria, France, got super interested in psychology. And it became really like cool to go and see Freud in Vienna and be analysed, talk about your mum and your dad and go through this process of psychoanalysis, analytic psychology. So this was like, for quite a long time this was done. And this so very cerebral approach basically to psychology and therapy, or psychology is by its nature, psyche, it's talking about the mind, became super dominant. It was very, very powerful. And it seems like it ought to work, basically. It seems pretty reasonable. If you can unravel the influences of your mom and your dad and get some of that repressed emotion moving, recontact the pain because, you know, of when your dad did not really give you attention when you were 2 years old and was just busy with his job or looking at his newspaper. And these kind of ideas, and get your superego not quite so kind of, try and get it to not be quite so extreme at times or whatever. It looks like it ought to work, psychology, but basically it doesn't work, to cut to the chase. You know, output studies invariably show that psychology doesn't really work. You know, it's hard to measure it because it's not like neurology where you're dealing with something tangible, but there are subjective monitoring studies. You know, and it does have some effect, or people report some effect, but often when you really look at their behaviour, if they've actually got over anxiety deeply or depression deeply, or you know, the kind of neurotic relationship to power that they develop because of their relationship with their mum or their dad or whatever, it doesn't really seem to create lasting change. And an ongoing criticism of psychology from like the 20s, 30s onwards is that it's trying to fit people into a society which is itself basically dysfunctional. And that it's also just something for rich middle class people to do, you know, to kind of agonise about their mother and their father and whatever. And it clearly has value, you know, it has value, but the trouble is that it doesn't really work very well. If you look at like areas of social services that really need to try and create change in people, with people who are involved in drug addiction or crime and stuff like this, programs that focus heavily with psychology tend to get a bit dropped because they just don't really work and they tend to be super expensive. You know, most psychologists have done a lot of training, 6 years to get ClinPsych, and it's like, you know, and they want a decent wage for that money, you know, like my ex was ClinPsych, she used to earn a bloody fortune, you know. But like, it doesn't really create the level of change. For the amount of effort and money that you have to put into the average client, it doesn't really seem to work, basically. You know, they go back to drug using, they go back to the bad behaviours that they've got and stuff like that. So what's kind of happened, I think, over the last century with psychology is that it's embedded itself in society, it's got some value, it's become a middle class kind of signalling behaviour in many ways. It's very invested, and it's a bit dysfunctional, and it's kind of stuck. You know, if I was to give this talk to a bunch of clinical psychologists, they'd be up in fucking arms because it's a threat. It's a threat to their livelihood, to their status, to their, you know, the amount of money that they're making. You know, if you said this to the American Psychological Association, they'd freak the fuck out. You know, but most of them in the back of their mind somewhere know that, yeah, you get a client in and you keep them going for a while, you know, and get some money out of them, and listen to their stories about their mum and their dad and take a little bit of the pressure off, but it doesn't really create deep change. And if it did create deep change, you'd be out of a fucking job, basically. So it's like, you know, so it's a problem. And I don't want to be like super neg on psychology because it is useful, you know, it is useful. But the fact is, it's clearly not the whole kind of solution, and it tends to just leave people, you know, a little bit socially fitting in a little bit better maybe than before. So into this comes one student of Sigmund Freud back in the 20s, Wilhelm Reich, Austrian, or what was then Austria, now a chunk of Ukraine. And he basically back in the 1920s started to work with clients. He was super interested. He was just in his 20s, about 20 years younger than Freud. And he rocked up in Austria, and he basically just really got into Freudian work, and he became kind of like, it was a very vibrant new school in those days. You know, Freud was the daddy, and there's all these other therapists in their 20s and stuff trying to, you know, become the good one, become daddy's favourite. And then, of course, acting out on daddy every now and again because, you know, daddy needs to be punished as well. But, you know, there was this whole dynamic going on with Freud and about 20, 30 other students, and then a wider kind of group of maybe 1,000 people who were mega into this new field of psychology. And for certainly quite a while, Wilhelm Reich was like the dominant, he was like the kind of lead You know, everyone wanted to take over from Freud at some point. You know, the old man's getting a bit older. I can become the king of psychology and lead it forward. And probably in the 20s, Freud was one of the leading contenders for that. You know, he was obviously, Reich, sorry, was one of the leading contenders for that. He was obviously brilliant, radical. He wasn't really concerned about fitting in very much and just doing the right things. He would go and explore and do all sorts of weird shit, basically. And he started to work with the body. So, client came to see Freud. You just start talking. You know, the psychologist usually sits back, sometimes behind a screen in those days, so he doesn't interfere with you and stuff, and like your process mentally, not physically. But like, and they just listen to you and talk to you and ask you questions. Reich would put him on like a massage table, and he starts kind of jabbing them here. This is one of his favourite places, the epigastrium. And people start making noises and freaking out and screaming and stuff like that. And he's just basically for about 5-10 years kind of experimenting on clients and just seeing if he can evoke something that's going to create change within them. You know, he's just trying to, he's radical, you know, he's trying new shit. And then he wrote all of this up in a book in 1933 called Character Analysis, which became super famous. He also, around the same time, wrote a book called The Function of the Orgasm, in which he basically said that if you can get humans sufficiently healthy psychologically to have good sex, so they're not just trying to control everything the whole time and just get off, then that will, in itself, the wave of orgasm, as it moves physiologically through the human body, will create healing. You know, this was super radical theory at the time, but it was also, you know, because a lot of the culture at that time was not sexually permissive. You know, it was like people were fascinated with sex because anybody who's not getting very much sex will be fascinated with sex. Anybody who's super rigid, people who are very rigid, will be fascinated with sex. It will be there in the back of their mind. But so Reich's ideas were very interesting, but also super radical. You know, trying to get clients to get sufficiently functional for all the jabbing and pushing and talking about the mother and stuff, so that they could have sex well enough, so then they could kind of keep their whole armouring system, as he called it, down. You know, that they could have an orgasm and just release excess tension from inside. That was his basic theory in simple words. Anyone got a question or anything?
Not on that, but you mentioned the word signalling behaviour. I've not heard this before, and I just would like to know what it means.
Oh, well, it's like when, say, someone on social media say I want people to think I'm really embodied, but actually I'm completely fucking not, basically. Just saying, you know, I just think of like some images or words that would summon that, I think will summon that up in the mind of someone else. So I'm signalling. You know, they had this concept like a decade ago when Web 2 came out, virtue signalling. You know, I'm trying to make other people think I'm a good person.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I thought, I might have got this wrong, you might refer to that as when a client goes into their therapist, speaks about their parents. Did you refer to signaling behaviour in that, or did I?
Can't quite remember
You
that.
might not have done.
I mean, I might have done. I mean, certainly, you know, the initial phases of psychoanalysis are tricky because people don't easily just talk about stuff inside. You know, you have to establish trust with the client, you know, so that you can actually talk about things. And then, of course, they're only your reflections as well, but that may not matter. Some you know, people going to that psychoanalysis may just, you know, try to make themselves out to be good all the time in what they say. They might have a strong censor internally, you know, abstraction. So anyway, Reich, you know, he was developing these radical theories around what he called body armour, segments of armour in the body, areas that became hardened, muscular tension increased. So we had these theories around armour, he had these theories around sex. He also had, at the time, what else did he have? He had another theory as well, but character structure. And so he was super radical. He was kind of got involved in Marxism a lot in the 1930s, and they kind of booted him out in the end because he was too sexually radical. He was trying to set up groups for women who'd been abused and stuff like this, and kind of get people to explain to them more about sex and holding boundaries and this kind of thing. And it seems the Marxists weren't so super into that. Generally, everything he did was super challenging to the kind of intelligentsia, the powerful people of the time. You know, it was just a bit too challenging. And so he would find himself kind of marginalised here and there. He also started to develop a kind of quasi-scientific theory of orgone. Anybody heard of orgone? And this kind of thing. And this was kind of, he got out of his normal lane, you know, and started to challenge mainstream science. You know, and psychology was a new thing, so you could kind of challenge shit, you know, but if you started challenging physics or something, you know, they're going to come on you pretty fucking hard, you know. Same as if I started challenging psychology now, they would come down on me hard because it's an organism trying to defend itself, you know, it's getting money and status from its behaviour. Orgone, I mean, his idea, it's a bit like Chinese ideas about qi or prana and stuff like that. There's a universal energy, basically. And if you can, in the human body, get it to flow freely and clearly, then you will be healthy. And you'll also develop more intelligence, useful intelligence. You know, so a lot of his things were around the idea that he would model the human body as being a bit like an earthworm, you know, which doesn't sound so great. But essentially, the earthworm moves through the soil. It's got these rings around its body, and if it wants to move through soil, it pulls one bit of its body up through a little bit forward, and then it lets the rest of it contract back and come back. You kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You know, how the earthworm moves. You did it at school or something like that. Anyway, if there's any kind of rigidity between rings, then the earthworm's pretty fucked, basically. It can't move forwards anymore, because it can start to move forwards, but then there's this rigidity, and it just gets stuck because it can't pull the rest of its body back. And he said that humans, we've got these 7 rings: ocular, oral, cervical around the throat, chest, diaphragmatic, abdominal, pelvic. And that if there's any unnatural bonding, you know, armouring between these rings, we'll work with this a bit hopefully sometime over the weekend, then energy in the body, you know, it's not the humans trying to tunnel its way through Earth, obviously, but energy in the body cannot flow. It gets blocked, basically. That was his concept. You've got these rings around the body, and if there's blockages between, unhealthy binding between the rings, then energy cannot flow in the body. That was his theory of, well, it's relating to, all of these theories are kind of interrelated, and this energy was orgone. So these were his ideas. History kind of took over, 1930s, end of the 1930s, Hitler was on the rise, and you know, it was clear that Europe was going to get thrown into some kind of world war, or certainly there was going to be a lot of shit coming down the pipe. You know, the Nazi Party were rocking up. And Reich had also he'd also written a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is actually the only book, as far as I'm aware, that got burned by the Nazis, the communists, and the Americans. None of them. They really didn't like this fucking book, you know. And it actually wasn't even that big a deal. I think the title just fucking, you know, it just freaked these people out, you know. So anyway, he'd written this book about kind of his psychological theory of how the Nazi Party had arisen, because the German family was so kind of repressed. It was super repressed, that was his theory. The German nuclear family was super repressed, and all the sexual desire that was repressed, particularly in the men, shot up into their minds, and then basically they saw Hitler as this kind of talismanic, you know, almost a cult leader, and just chanting, and they just went there, started chanting, and then soon became motivated to just, you know, become warriors for the Third Reich and this kind of thing. That was Reich's theory, which is really what the mass psychology of fascism is about. Anyway, where were we? Nazis came along. Obviously, Reich wasn't into the Nazis, so he did what a lot of the other intellectuals from Europe did. He went to America, which he kind of assumed would be like, you know, the land of the free, as immigrants fleeing Europe, where there's a lot of still colonial and structural oppression, you know, hierarchies and feudalism still going on. He went to the States, thought it would be wonderful. continued with his orgone studies, tried to get Einstein, who was a super famous scientist in America, originally European as well, to like orgone. He didn't really like orgone very much, or he didn't want to get involved in it. And Reich kind of initially was a bit famous in America in the 40s, and then he fell foul of the FDA at some point, who thought he was some kind of quack trying to make money treating cancer and this kind of thing. And he was such a raging individual, he refused to really defend himself very well, ended up sentenced to prison in the 50s and died in prison. Which bit?
That Reich died in prison.
He had a heart attack. He was sentenced to 2 years, basically, Lewisburg or something like that, and he died about 10 months in, something like 1957. So,
How old was he?
he was 60 or 59, something like that. Yeah. Well, it was a shame. He was a very radical thinker, and his nature was that he wasn't going to really back down. You know, he would just keep exploring. He used to write about it, but a lot of people were saying to him around this time, you know, because he was famous when he first got to America. Americans were in New York, were super interested in psychology, and they were saying to him, like, dude, just stop with the orgone, drop that, keep doing the character structure and the sex, you know, it's radical, but keep doing that and keep looking at the armour. You know, particularly character structure and armour were like radical in psychology, but not super radical, you know. They could be done. The sex was a bit on the edge, and then orgone was like totally fucking out there. So people are saying this to Reich, you know, Matt, dude, look, stay in your own fucking lane, you know, man, you know, stay in your own lane. Don't do all this weird shit. You can do a little bit of weird shit with sex, but you know, orgone's too much for us. We can't follow you because we're psychologists, and they're going to think we're mad if we start talking about orgone. You know, it's understandable.
Think about Wilhelm Reich. I mean, I love him because he's such a luminary, and he's like a life force just expressing itself. But why do you think he died so young of a heart attack?
I mean,
you know, I'm just wondering about his
I
psychology.
don't know.
You know, his psychology and his well-being, his energy system. Why did his heart give out at age 15?
Well, I mean, one of the things that happened with Reich was he became very popular with conspiracy theorists in the wake of his death, especially from the 60s, 70s onwards, who thought that he got a cure for cancer, and that the FDA found this a threat for the drug companies, and so they kind of killed him in prison, got him put in prison. The evidence for that doesn't really stand up, but at the same time, because basically he could have defended himself and not gone to prison, but he just chose to defend himself. You know, he wanted to tell the judge about orgone, and he assumed that America being the land of the free, they just say, the judge would say, hey man, orgone, really cool, don't go to prison. No, but lawyers are saying to him, look dude, you need a fucking lawyer, this is America, it's hard, you know, you litigate for anything.
So he went to prison because of his research?
Well, I wasn't intending to talk about Reich, everyone's interested in it, but like, what basically happened with Reich was sometime in around the early 50s, someone wrote a kind of hit piece about him for Harper's Bazaar, the earlier version of this magazine in America, saying he was just a quack who was just trying to have sex with his clients, and that he was selling them these cancer treatment called orgone accumulators and stuff, which was this box he devised to increase your orgone. And these kind of stories, and from that article, which attracted interest, you know, because he was this kind of, you know, exploitative, predatory quack that was going around, that idea from him, the FDA felt like, well, we have to do something, you know. They were very new. I think Reich was maybe even the first person they actually prosecuted, you know. But anyway, so the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in America, you know, regulatory body around drugs and stuff, they started to investigate Reich and all of his orgone accumulators and his books on sex, you know, and all these super rigid kind of, you know, J. Edgar Hoover type of guys, you know, just investigating Reich and all this mad shit that he was up to. And they tried to kind of get into court. And the court date got put off for a while, as I recall. And Reich knew lawyers, because he was part of, for a while at least, part of the intelligentsia in New York, which was radical democratic people, you know, and there were lawyers. And the lawyers are saying, basically, like I said, you know, don't fucking represent yourself, Wilhelm, you know, you don't know it. And he's more like, this is the land of the free, I'm going to be okay, I'm just going to tell, and so that's what the FDA took him to court. He probably could have avoided getting, if If he had a proper lawyer, there wasn't much evidence against him, but it was like proper hard evidence. You know, he never said that he could cure cancer. You know, he just said that this box might help. You know, and he was doing studies with it. You know, so a good lawyer probably would have got him off, but the way he was, he didn't go for that. He got 2 years. And maybe he was just heartbroken and kind of feeling like his whole work was destroyed and that no one was listening to him and whatever.
That doesn't sound like him.
No?
Well, you know, he just doesn't give a shit about what anyone else thinks, and he's just going to carry on. Like, he sounds like a high blood pressure guy with a, you know,
Well, it
heart
could be.
condition.
Yeah,
you know.
it could be.
And I'm just wondering what was out of balance in him, because he's clearly a genius, and he's delivering so much truth about, you know, the human, but something in him, there was a blind spot maybe, that's what I'm wondering.
Yeah, I mean, there was talk, you see, when he originally, now we're disappearing off a little bit, but this time, character structure, which is something I do a workshop on, I don't want to go into it here because it's too long and complicated, but he created 4 character types. I mean, it seems like, I've never been able to track down who did this. I know got some contact as relatives of the people, but like, there was a 5th type that came along called the psychopath, and that the idea was, or aggressive nowadays, well, that was based on Reich. That was a kind of, but some of his students wanted some payback for all the extreme way that he put them through. It was pretty mean, you know, but like, the best book, the biography of Reich is called Fury on Earth, I think. It's by one of his former students, Myron Sharaf. And you can, I don't know if you've read it, but that's worth a read. That really goes deep into all of Reich's life and girlfriends and sex dramas at the Organon, his ranch and stuff. But the bottom line is, yes, he died. And a few other people kind of picked up working with the body, and particularly, like he did, he integrated it with psychoanalysis. He wasn't trying to start something completely new, but he integrated it with psychoanalysis. So you're talking about the past, and then you're also doing the exercises. A guy called Alexander Lowen came along, who was a student of Reich, and he developed this thing called bioenergetics. And that was also, you know, a mixture of psychoanalysis and body practices, focusing a lot on anger, on bashing cushions and stuff like that. And you know, where I also struggle a bit with Lowen and Reich a little bit is that, like, I mean, Lowen particularly, there's a tendency to think that all of this, you know, kind of therapy, like the stuff you've been doing and will continue doing, all comes from these Western luminaries, and it doesn't really. You know, there's probably a lot of it came from shamanic tribes, found its way through all sorts of things in Amazon and Siberia and stuff like that, and they were just kind of picking it up in Western society. I don't think the spring of knowledge just suddenly came up in the middle of the West, you know. It was not like that. But sometimes people have that impression. Where are we getting to? Okay, well anyway, Reich died somewhat in disgrace. The psychological bodies that were new at the time in 50s America, you know, soon distanced themselves from his work. And because in psychoanalysis, one of the key things about becoming a psychoanalyst is that you have to go through analysis yourself. You know, you can't just learn it in school and like start giving it to people. You can go through analysis yourself. Having all this Reichian shit added into that, you know, people didn't want to do that. You know, they were nice people. They didn't want to dig into all this stuff. They were in this very abstracted state anyway. And so therapy from the 60s onwards, you know, became much more mind orientated, and a lot of interesting mind stuff was developed. CBT, Scott Aronson, cognitive behavioral therapy, you know, looking at your patterns of thinking and, you know, seeing your blind spots, this kind of thing, where you've got hidden prejudices, useful stuff, you know. And at the same time, I mean, also dialectical behavior therapy, maybe some of you know internal family systems, anybody, more recent, super popular, you know, and this kind of thing. Lots of these kinds of therapies, all kind of quite cerebral, based around the mind, based at looking at childhood, or looking at dialectical behavior therapy, looking at very clearly how you're interacting with people and stuff like that. At the same time, that was all kind of from the mainstream, or the kind of accepted level of psychology coming in. And at the same time, from the 60s onwards, Osho, radical counterculture guru, basically from India, You know, a lot of he started to develop some basic kind of therapeutic meditations like dynamic. Some of you do dynamic meditation, Kundalini. But more kind of significant with Osho was all the kind of therapists in Europe and America, West Coast America and New York, who were a bit radical. They all went to see Osho because he was like this ultra cool countercultural guru in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so they all went to see him, and he said, "Therapist guys, just work on the people in my ashram." So it became a huge melting pot in Pune, India, particularly for about a decade, where all these different therapists from, you know, Arthur Yanov, primal therapy, encounter therapy, where you have to talk about all your judgments of other people, and they tell their judgments about you, and then you have to go into all the emotions around it. Very, you know, slightly underground, very confrontational therapies, you know, tantra, sexual stuff, you know, having to have dates with different women or men and then give each other feedback about how it was afterwards in a structured way. All these kind of radical, challenging kind of therapeutic approaches, which simultaneously kind of scare the crap out of us and also somewhere attract us, you know. All that stuff emerged in a kind of, all came together with Osho, you know. It's not super credited, but that's how a lot of that stuff came through, and all sorts of therapies mixed and intermingled in Pune in this time. So that was a big thing, and simultaneously you had kind of shamanic traditions coming into the West, you know, shamans, stuff like that. You had, you know, ayahuasca, or just, you know, stuff coming from India, like asana yoga, what's his name, I can't remember that. The bloke who wrote Light on Yoga, I can't remember his name. Iyengar, you know, stronger, kind of, more kind of yang types of yoga. All sorts of alternative stuff came in, so you had the West making modern types of, you know, more cognitive therapy. You had some body-based or drug-based or super provocative kind of confrontation-based therapy coming in from different places. And that time was like a big, I think a lot of people in that era who got involved in that stuff did make quite a lot of change in their life. You know, they did. Maybe it's not a complete blank slate that stays like that, but they cleared out a lot of the charge in their system, and they did become new people to a degree. But I guess the bottom line at some point was, you know, both the kind of mainstream and the increasingly abstracted nature of the human psyche and the human model of self, you know, won the day in a sense. You know, particularly with the arrival of like Facebook and Web 2, signaling behaviours and the option for that, mass movement, you know, because anybody, you know, if I'm not going to do this, right? But if I suddenly announced that you had to walk around and give negative judgments about other people and receive them, you would probably freak out. But a part of you will be attracted to, I'm not going to do this, but I just want to give it an example, that the human being is in this kind of state, super abstracted, you know, and you're attracted to do something really radical, but if you can just do some signaling and try and save the planet instead, chances are you're going to go for that, you know, you're going to go for that. If you can get, you know, you're just going to keep hiding, basically, and even somewhere deep inside, particularly if you wanted to come to a group like this, there's that desire for confrontation, you know, it's like, it probably will get marginalised and just stuck like this. Does that kind of can you relate to that at all?
Yeah.
You know? I did all that heavy shit mad therapies because I knew I was completely fucked up at the time, and I just didn't have enough ego to stop myself, which was good, because if I had more ego like I do now, then I wouldn't do it. I would make excuses and avoid them. That is what I would do. You know, so I'm lucky that I did that at that time, and when I got involved with Osho, kind of right at the end of the 90s or early 2000s, it was like the peer pressure from everyone was like, you need to do groups, man. You know, if you want to be part of our gang, you know, our tribe, you need to do groups. You know, you can't just fanny around doing chakra breathing and shit. You got to, yeah, it's okay. You know, doing a little bit of dynamic once a month. No, you go to Osho University, or you go to one of the heavy institutions where you really face your shit. You know, and in a sense that's good, because if you've kind of developed a bit, you won't do that. You know, you'll just keep, you know, I mean, who here would rather avoid than deeply self-face if you're actually honest?
Rather avoid than what?
Rather avoid than really face yourself if you're honest in the moment. You know?
Which part are you talking to?
Yeah. Well, yeah, fair enough. You know, fair enough. But we are caught in that, in a sense, you know, and this kind of thing. What else was I going to say? Anyone else got a question? Well, let's work out what I was going to say. Yeah.
What's the difference between libido as Freud conceived of it and orgone? Is it just like one is basically vague and mental without making any theories about where it's coming from, and then the difference with Reich is that he's like saying this is the same as plants.
I mean, with libido, the thing that was with libido was that it was not transpersonal in philosophical language. That it was just you experience sexual drive, you know, or you experience drive. The tradition that Freud actually came from was like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, where those guys says there's this like willpower that is transpersonal will. It's operating through humanity and it's trying to get us to step up all the fucking time. That's why some people experience this immense pressure to do something different from what their parents did, you know. So, but with Freud, he kind of put that back in a box and said it's just libido, it's in the individual, it's not in society or in the group, or it's not transpersonal. And then with orgone, it was, again, transpersonal both. You know, he said orgone has to flow in the human body, and it also has to flow in the world. You know, it has to flow in the world. He had this ranch in Maine, it's a state in America, where they had all this orgone machinery and stuff, you know, to flow in there. And then he also developed the idea of deadly orgone, norgone, negative orgone, which was this really bad kind of orgone that would just fuck you up completely if you got in touch with it and this kind of thing. Fascinating.
In today's age of the technology, can organes be measured or seen visibly now?
I mean, I don't know, but the last guy who was doing any experiments about this that I know of was a bloke called James DeMayo in America, who died literally about a year ago. I tried to interview him once, but he wasn't up for it. But I don't think, I mean, Wright's thing with orgone, he would notice things like particle movement. He used to spend the money that he made from like treating people, rich people in New York. He would invest that in like these really high power microscopes and all sorts of weird scientific gear to try and prove that orgone existed. You know, he was writing books about it. He was trying to convince Einstein that it was real, and that in some of his like orgone accumulator boxes that the temperature would change more than it should do if it was just a normal box and stuff like that. So he tried really hard to prove it scientifically. That was his whole approach. In many ways, if he just left orgone rather like the Nietzschean will to power, you know, he probably wouldn't have got so much shit, but he was determined. Nietzsche never tried to prove that the will to power existed as some measurable force, you know. But he didn't do that. He really tried to prove that orgone existed. He wanted the physicists to accept it, you know. But and it may be true. That's the thing. Orgone might be true, but it's such a radical difference to how science evolved in the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Again, it's like the same situation. You have to tear all this stuff up. But there's fuck tons of people who are making good money out of science, and it's developed all sorts of useful shit. You know, you're just suddenly going to go back and say that the theory of atoms might be a bit wrong and stuff, you know, reductionism is wrong or something, you know, it's like, there's a huge investment on multiple levels. So as soon as he moved into that field of trying to convince physicists that orgone was real, you know, they're just going to shoot him down left, right and centre. They're going to find a way to undermine you and fuck you up, you know, it's like, that's just how any entity, macro entity behaves.
Like East and West medicine, like Chi's like billions, hundreds of millions of people kind of invested in that in the East, but Chi,
Yeah.
like hundreds of people invested in that in the East, but in the West it's like
Well, they believe in it, certainly.
yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist here.
No, because it has to be measurable in order for it to exist. You
Yeah.
know, so that and in a sense, it's kind of fair enough. You know, because you can't just believe in every bit of madness that people come out with. You know, I mean, fuck knows what will happen. You know, like you do need that side that wants to see something objectively real. You know, I don't know how long you guys have been around New Age society, but at some point, you know, you can listen to some really fucking mad shit, and you just think, what the fuck planet are you on, man? You know, like, come on, you want to see something real, you know? Make guys know New York would listen to this stuff and would say, make the light bulb come on. I've got it in my hand, make it come on, then I'll believe you. Otherwise, shut the fuck up and go away. And, you know, it's a bit harsh, but it's also, in a sense, fair enough. You know, you want to see some kind of fucking miracle. You want to see Lazarus get up from the dead. You know, you want to see someone go in the organ accumulator and be completely free of cancer or whatever. You know, you want it to be so obvious that there's no disputing it anymore.
But
Anyway.
there's so much we don't know.
Yeah.
I think our perception of physics and everything, we're just touching the surface.
Yeah.
So I think we have to have an open mind. Anything is possible.
Yeah.
When we put limits on it, that's just our ego in a way, trying to control everything.
Yeah. It
And
is.
who
I mean,
knows what's out
you're totally right.
there.
But at the same time, you know, you do need a kind of limiting force. Otherwise, you're just going to, you know, you just have. It's very hard to also develop if you don't have boundaries. If you don't have a concept of boundaries. You know, when I started to do therapy, I wanted the mirror. You know, in a sense, I wanted something to be mirrored back to me so I could develop. When you look at kids who were never given much boundaries by their parents, they really struggle and act out. They often get into crime because they want someone to kind of say no. They want someone to say no, it's not okay. So these forces are in a dynamic interplay.
Yeah.
You know, this over desire to control everything and say only that is rational and everything you think is a heap of bullshit, off you go. With at the same time, okay, but is this really real? Is there some way to say it's real? Can
Yeah.
you limit, you know?
With a sprinkling imagination and open-mindedness, yeah.
You need some level of that,
Yeah.
yeah. You need some level of open-mindedness, but then, you know, you hypothesize, test, and all this old scientific thing, you know, you test theories out, you try and work out. But certainly with science, I think it's valid criticism. It's like this is kind of tyranny of the measurable, you know, because we can measure it, therefore it's true.
Mm.
But what if other things are true, but you just can't measure them at the minute, you know? It's,
Well, look at quantum physics, what that's opening up,
yeah,
turning its head on. Even the stuff that my kids are learning
Yeah.
at school isn't true anymore, a lot of it.
yeah. Well, that's what, you see, the quantum physicists were trying to take over physics for a while, I think, in the 50s and 60s, but they just put them in their own department. You know, you go in, that's your department over there, mate. Don't come into my fucking, you know, I'm dealing with atoms here and molecules. Don't come in here with your stupid mad theories, you know, it's just defensive behaviour that organisms go through, and it's also got some validity as well, you know. You know, it's like I don't personally believe there's some miracle out there which is going to save humanity. You know, we're almost like in an alchemical vessel in the world where our interactions and the desire of the individual to transcend themselves is what really makes the difference. I don't believe it's going to come from the outside. You know, change. It's not going to come from the outside. You know, but we're seeing it now with all the, you know, the possibilities that Facebook and mass action kind of from social media created, you know, that could never happen before. Has it created much real change in the world? I don't think so. It's probably made it just worse as it is better. You know. Personally, it's just my personal opinion. Anybody else on all this stuff? Before we just move a little bit on. Because what I wanted to also, you know, really on a practical level, like, you know, I think most people, I can certainly relate to the problem of, you know, having developed a mind, got a little bit stable with it, it's a bit dysfunctional. I'd rather do psychotherapy than really do something radical, you know, that really threatens to knock the whole thing down. And what really blocks that actually is more to do with the experience of love, in my opinion. Because if you really feel love from the inside, you will do radical stuff, you know, because you have this sense of inner support. You know, it's like feeling your lower back. When you can feel your lower back, you feel more okay to just be in the moment. And when you don't feel it, or when you don't feel love from the inside, you know, because we have a biological need for love, or in my opinion, we need some level of love. We will then just develop behaviours to try and get it from the outside, to get people to give us love, to give us affection, or at least if we can't get that, attention. You know, we just need to take in love from somehow. You know, take it in from somehow. And I think what happens really is the first kind of stage of being human is like somewhere learning how to get love from other people from the outside. And many people won't even get to that stage, really. You've got a kind of proto-human being, say someone he's just not interested in love at all or whatever very much. I don't know. He's not, and he's just kind of armoured, or she's armoured and blocked off from the need. You know, they're super functional in society. They don't care about love. They don't think about anything like that. You know, they just focus on functioning. How well do I function in society? And then maybe there's a stage where you want to get love from the outside, from someone else. My drawing's pretty crap, but you want to say the least. But you're kind of, how can I get someone to love me? You know, how can I get someone to give me love, to accept me? You know, these kind of stages you go through, learning how to get love and intimacy from other people. And then maybe if you do enough of that and you get that, and then you keep opening your body, keep clearing stuff up from the past, keep doing workshops or getting on your own journey, whatever that looks like, and it's authentic because it works, you start to get to a state where you don't need to kind of do things to get love from other people. You know, you actually feel it internally sustaining you. I'm calling it love. It could also be like the sensation of the body in a certain way. If you can feel your body a lot, you don't actually need to hug other people so much. You know, that if you look at that, the armoured person denies the need for physical contact. You know, they armour themselves so that they don't need anything. They don't want to be reliant on anybody on the outside. Can you relate to that? I experienced that for many years. You know? You just armour yourself, and then I use alcohol or drugs, weed, you know, just to displace or work with some of the feelings that are generated by the fact that I'm armoured. You know, I'm moving around in this armoured state through life. And then at some point when some of that armouring came out, you know, it was like suddenly like, I need love. I need love. You know, that was and the vulnerability of just articulating that is intense, you know. And then I'm going around looking, how can I get in love relationships? Where can I get love from? How can I get it out of other people? And then, you know, I'm doing a lot of therapy and stuff, but hopefully you can relate to the journey. At some point, it became more, there's a feeling of okayness inside. But typically, this is the kind of journey, and there's other ways of addressing this or articulating it and stuff. It's just one kind of way that people going through therapy groups often find useful. But this transition, particularly from being in a kind of either armoured or defended state, you know, a bit isolated from the possibility of love or intimacy, you know, is how does someone actually come out of that state? You know, what if you're someone who's quite armoured, maybe you've got trauma, you know, yeah, ideally you'd like love from another person, but that's fucking scary, basically. You have to open yourself up to another human. You don't know if you can really trust them. Maybe they're just fucking shit on you. Maybe you've had bad trauma with partners, whatever gender, orientation, before. Can you relate to the kind of conflict? You know, that conflict that people go through, you know, wanting love, but then, okay, I'm going to go out with this person, and then you start to get closer, but then there's fear. Because inside, it's like, can I really trust this person? When I first started getting girlfriends again, when I came out of this phase, I was going out with someone, and when I didn't trust them, I would be a bit of what helped me trust was to feel their emotions. You know, because somewhere inside of me, if someone was really emotional, I could see that they weren't putting it on. I think for a lot of my life, I was used to people kind of saying things, but they weren't really true. You know, they were talking about themselves, but they weren't really true. And what I would do was just trigger this person by being a bit flirtatious with other women, basically. Motherfucking things to do, which would piss her off like fucking crazy, and she would go nuts. But then in that, I started to trust more, because I could feel the intensity of emotion that she was going through. And, you know, that's not a very good way to go about things. It's not a good way to go about it. But in reality, probably most humans do find you need a way to establish trust. You know, someone can go up to you and say, I love you. How do you know if it's true? And how do they even know if it's true? Maybe it's just a learned behaviour to try and get sex. You know, maybe it's a learned behaviour to try and get some intimacy or connection, or to make the other person think you're a certain kind of person. This is a problem. So this, you know, in many ways is a huge thing. What do you think a healthy way out of this issue is? If you're someone who, somewhere in the background, you kind of want love, maybe you kind of close the idea off because it's, you know, it's too challenging, but it's there. Can anybody think of a way to move out of this armoured state and actually feel like, okay, I can open to love? What would make it more okay?
Bioenergetics.
That's not really, you've got to get a bit more. It's not just bioenergetics.
I'm thinking like I've had long relationships, and I feel like I could do like both at the same time. Be very armored in all my usual ways, everywhere except with that one person,
Mm-hmm.
which I guess is very common as well.
Yep. Yeah.
But maybe there is a kind of practice in that relationship that you can extend.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Focusing on one person and then slowly, step by step, learning to trust them. They're probably doing the same with you. That's one thing.
Would you like extend that, the lessons that you get from that, to more broadly? Like I'm thinking my family, my sisters and my mum, I have a very armored relationship with them, and I guess you can kind of use what you get from your romantic relationship with them then in a way.
Yeah.
The trust that you build through that.
Yeah. I mean, I went through a phase when I started to do therapy. I think a lot of people get it, where I tried to also get my family to kind of heal as well. You know, and as an adopted kid from Essex, with very Essex kind of dysfunctional family, also beautiful in their own way. You know, that wasn't really going to work, but my intention was to try and get the family on board. It's like, I guess in an ideal relationship, you know, when the love relationship, it's like it's you and the other person, and you're both opening and talking about what you need to trust, and slowly going on this journey of coming closer. So you've got to see if that's going to work with other family members. If you start doing it with other partners, this partner might feel challenged by it. You know, but that's part of tantra and stuff, and people jump into trying to do things like that. Usually it doesn't work initially. But like, I'm just talking around it a bit. But you've got to look for, just look. I mean, I guess you put feet in the water. You know, with some of my adopted family members. You know, I share a bit of vulnerability or something about what I'm feeling about something, not directly to them, but it's like, and see if there's something coming back, you know, if there's a reciprocation, or if it's just like, well, what'd you do that for? No, you just, I don't know, I just try. But there's something more direct that I'm kind of looking for here, rather than a long, slow journey, which is totally valid.
Meet your shadow, maybe?
So, this chap here.
I'm thinking, only from my own experience at Osho, touch.
Mm-hmm.
And tactility to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that starts to make you feel trust in the other person when they touch you.
Well,
Or you touch them.
like a head on the shoulder,
Mm-hmm.
something simple.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
David,
There was one other chap here. I was just gonna. Is that okay? Was it you?
Yeah.
Did you?
I said accept your shadow. You know,
Mm-hmm.
be comfortable, with what you think is strong about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's moving in that direction. There's one thing I'm kind of casting about for.
I know, for me it feels like an active lesson. I was saying I've got to respect my own boundaries, so I've got to come into a boundary situation where I can feel safe without honoring my own defences, because I'm taking my armour outwards.
Yeah, safety. That's basically the thing. If the person here feels safe, basically, then usually, however safe they feel, then they can move towards someone else. And that feeling of how, for some people, they initially manifest that. I'll ask a couple of questions, take up ones in a minute, but it's by trying to control the environment. First of all, you try to control the environment around you, so that you can feel safe. You do whatever you can, or just to set things up in such a way that you can then feel safe. There's an underlying need for someone who's caught in this kind of complex, where maybe they primary love relationships or with mum and dad were broken, or there's been trauma where they had a love relationship and it just got really fucked up at some point, and they got really hurt and they had to shut off. It's natural, you put on some armour you know, to keep yourself away. And then sometimes you learn ways to try and make yourself feel safe in an environment. But what I wanted to say really, just to cut, what time is it? By the way, 'cause I'm gonna get to some of this shit.
22.
Okay. There's a bit center here in your belly, basically, primate power center, which most people, especially thinking people, tend to be cut off from. But if you feel that center, even if, say, for example, you're a 4'3" woman who just happens to be super attracted to a 6-foot bodybuilder, male bodybuilder, you will know that you have power, despite the actual physical power differential. When you have energy in your belly, it's where boundaries are mediated from in primates. Basically, it's nothing to do with your thinking. You know, it's when you have energy in your belly, you feel confident with putting out boundaries, anger. You can be very clear with boundaries, and you know you can be clear with boundaries. So it makes it easier. Say for someone who's been traumatized, been hurt in relationships, but wants to keep moving forwards. If they have a lot of feeling in their belly, an energy there, and this sense, hey, I can just hold boundaries, you know, without being super rigid and tense and fuck you, but just like, actually, this is not okay for me. And you can say it with such clarity, but the person, people won't really dispute it, you know. Then basically that person starts to feel much more safe just to approach other people, because if it goes wrong, they can put the foot down. And it's still challenging, but this is a kind of core principle. When you take some of these techniques from bioenergetics or therapy, modern therapies, or well, therapies that were popular back then, it's a core principle when you start to apply it to social models or love models. If you feel safe in your own being, that has nothing to do with how you think or manipulative behaviors that you've learned. You know, if you feel safe in your own being, you will feel safe to go into new situations. You know, and you do it little by little, but that's an incredibly important point, you know, I think. Anybody got a question or insight about that? Because we're going to work with this in a bit.
So what's to stop? So you do lots of work in
Yep.
your, I call it the somatic centre, but
Okay.
and I've had a lot of release already this weekend. But my brain has got a predictive neuro pathway of life isn't safe for me.
Mm-hmm.
So once I've cleared it in my body, what's to stop my brain just keep repeating that pattern?
Well, the reason the brain, you see, what happens is, really, when you look at, say, an average human, this is such a bad fucking drawing, it's terrible, but average human being,
E.T.
this idea of blocks, yeah, that's one E.T. You know, energetic blocks in the body, because we don't want to encounter these bits of repressed energy and the emotionality that's held in them, we learn workarounds, and that's really what you're saying. Basically, there are workarounds that we develop at a mental level to go through life. Maybe we never challenge anyone who's a perceived authority because we might get angry, and so we learn to please. Maybe we never allow ourselves to be vulnerable because there's a lot of emotional pain inside, which we don't want to feel. So, you know, we always try and have control over our environment. Yeah? Now, when you take this stuff out by doing this therapy, where you get 90%, 80, 90% gone, those mental behaviors are still there, but they're not cemented in place by the blocks. So what happens is, say you're a 25-year-old guy who's straight, fancies women, but never goes after the one he fancies the most, because if it all gets fucked up, then he's going to feel really shit. So it's better to go for that one over there who's got a history of drug use and low self-esteem. You know, she is safer, essentially. It's just an example. He's in a bar, he sees someone really pretty, he thinks, I want to go up and talk to that woman, and then it's like, no, go for that more fucked up one in his own mind looking over there. But then this whole hardwiring of behaviour is no longer in place. He will challenge that belief. If you've got 80% of this stuff out, he'll be like, no, what are you thinking about, man? Just go up and talk to her. No reason why not. You know, so this is how you know, but the mental, you asked a question about this earlier, you know, if you've got, you know, maybe you don't get everything out of the body, but if you've got a big chunk of it out, this mental hardwiring, it won't be hardwired, the patterns will be there. But you have to get enough of it out, because the reverse dynamic is people do a couple of groups. I affirm that I am completely healed. And then wake up every morning and do this, and then they go back into a situation where, you know, it becomes clear to them that they're not completely healed, and they just shouted at the woman in the queue about nothing or whatever, and then they're kind of completely thrown, you know, because they're trying to use their minds to create a self-image, but it's not backed up by what's going on in their body, which is still 99% of this stuff inside. You know, like I said yesterday, whenever you hear anyone say, I don't need to do work on my mother because I cleared all that stuff, whenever you hear the word cleared all that stuff, you can guarantee 20 years in, as a therapist, that person is just about to have a major episode of that thing, because that's how the unconscious works. We convince ourselves, and some workshop leaders will now tell you, you've now cleared all your stuff, you know, and it's worth a try. You know, it's worth a try to go out in society and model it, but then if it's not true, then you will have to keep working. Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah, it does, yeah.
I think there's a tendency to fall back as well. When you go out in the real world and there's a difficult situation and you're flummoxed, and then you go back to something, you know, a childhood pattern, and
which
kind
works,
of
and you
lose
know.
ground. I mean, that's my experience.
I mean, the real difficult bottom line is that we hold a fuck ton of stuff. Basically, that's the real problem. You know, many people starting on therapy just want to know, well, how long am I going to have to do this shit for? You know, and the practical answer is until, you know, you've got enough of it out of your system that you can, you know, achieve the goals that you want in life. You know, and it's like, and there's just a lot more than the average person thinks, and it's just, even with stuff like what we're doing this weekend, you know, it doesn't just go. You know, it takes time. You have to work energy centers or work muscle groups or whatever. It just takes quite a long time.
And then you like complementary kind of therapies as well, because like one's like digging into this stuff, but there are still kind of, because it's like patterns that might just run. That might draw you back in. You know what I mean? In a way that like this stuff.
I don't personally believe. I mean, the mind comes back in. You know, we might have an experience of real openness, and then something just triggers us a little bit as we're going home, some news story, and we just feel the whole kind of thing being re-embedded back in our brain, you know. But I think when you've cleared enough, you kind of have much more choice. I can feel it coming back in, some political relationship story or whatever, and my whole mind ramping up its defensive mode again, you know. I can feel that, but I have more choice to stay open. To say no defensive mode, I don't actually need it right now, I'm not on the fridge. I don't need to reorientate myself in the way that all women are dangerous or all men are bad or whatever the defensive, you know, strategy has been invoked.
You know, you're talking about kind of like patterns and like it's almost like the workarounds of like your mind or your body, your system giving you bidding to say, look, you can work around like that. You know what I mean? Like, how about this route? How about that route? Like this kind of workaround. Where it's like, you know, like the kind of mention like the ditch and stuff like that is you do get neural patterns that become very well drawn.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like sometimes that just repetitiveness might
Yeah.
bring you back to something that actually you don't want to be doing. The child might not, but you kind of need to do both in a way.
Once you get enough openness, you know, then you have more choice. You know, and it's ongoing. And you need the groundedness and this sense of boundaries held from there creates a feeling of safety. You know? I don't want to talk too much. I know you've got some really valid questions which would be super interesting, but I wanted to make it a bit more practical because probably the fastest way to start to get some energy going at a belly level is working with anger. You know? And in a group setting, there's the option to set it up safely so that you can be angry facing other people. And just have that to experience it and to start, it helps people start to come out of the idea that one, they're either a victim or that they need to control their environment through whatever means, you know. It's like when you start to get confident with anger and you have a physical experience of being angry in a safely held, so you're not under any physical danger, that's very, very useful. You know, some of you, I can see, have not had so much experience with this, and I think it will be useful from both genders, and I think it's a good idea, basically. So what I'm kind of proposing is that we have like a 20-minute tea break, and then come back in loose clothing, and I'll explain it all, you know, and then we'll work with anger, basically, directly. No physical contact. It'll just be safely held and structured, and I'll explain it in advance. But if you can get into this and make progress, it will massively empower you. You know, intimacy is impractical, really, until you feel like in your body you can hold safe boundaries. You will just go to your mind and strategize, you know, and there's no need, you know. If you can get energy in here and this feeling of being more confident with anger, you know, you just will realize you don't need all this crap anymore. You know? Does it sound like a good plan?
Sounds scary.
Yeah, it will be scary for some of you. For others, you may have experience, but try to be open to it. I will explain everything, and you can ask questions, and we'll give it a try. I like to deliver quite strong medicine, but to try and do it super safely and with consent. So we'll have a 20-minute tea break, and then we'll give it a crack. So 11:10, please be back in the room.